Greetings, viewers, and welcome to another episode of Unrepentant Geeking. I'm your host, Shaun Petros, and I am joined this time around by special guest host...
Petros Ioannou, writer and creator of My Life as a Video Game.
Yep, Petros will also be the future co-host for the History of Stargate when we eventually get that off the ground, and it's coming, I promise. But for now, he and I are here to talk about a slightly different topic. Okay, so we've got a lot to cover. Let's just dive into it. What do you think of this current trend of splitting stories up, splitting films up into multiple movies when maybe the source material wasn't exactly meant that way? Like, of course, there's The Hobbit, which has been split into 3 movies. And then there's the last 2 Hunger Games, which is taking the 3rd book and splitting it up into 2 films. Now, The Hunger Games, everybody's saying The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 1 is really good, except for the fact that its ending feels abrupt and just out of nowhere. And of course it does, because they've inserted an artificial break in this story when there wasn't one. And look, I like the Hobbit films. Okay, I enjoyed the first 2. I suspect I will enjoy the 3rd, but I also suspect in the end I'll come away thinking, this was fun, but you probably could have done better if you just did 2 movies instead of 3.
You want my answer to this?
Yes, I want. What is your take on all this?
Horse shit.
Don't hold anything back.
Frankly, it is killing some of these movies. Let's start back with what I think maybe the earliest version of it, which is looking at the Harry Potter one, which was split into 2 movies.
Right.
Now, Deathly Hallows isn't even the longest of the books, for starters. No, Goblet of Fire is. Or is it Order of Phoenix? It's one of those 2, in terms of sheer length. But the first part of those 2 movies is boring. I don't care what anyone says. It's all character stuff with nothing else going on. It is just so dull because it is missing the excitement part. I love character development, don't get me wrong, but your character development needs to be balanced out with excitement. At the end of the day, people go to movies to enjoy them. And when you've just watched 6 movies that had some action, adventure, and character development and had this great feel, and then suddenly you have this really dark movie that is like interesting in terms of character development, but has no ending and doesn't pay it off, then of course it is going to not work well. And then the second part of that was really exciting and fun, but had 0 character development because all the character development was front loaded. So of course those 2 movies combined would have made one really good 2.5 hour, 3 hour movie, and I would have been happy for that for the final Harry Potter movie. But to split them into 2 is ridiculous. And The Hobbit even more ridiculous because it's even shorter than any one of the Lord of the Rings movies. And every single one of the Hobbit movies is as long, if not longer, than each of the regular Lord of the Rings movies. And it's been divided into 3 freaking movies.
Okay, a couple of comments. First of all, to be fair to The Hobbit, they also have drawn upon a bunch of the appendix material from Return of the King. The stuff that was going on off camera, as it were, but was happening. Like, a lot of the stuff with Gandalf where he goes off on his own, that was all happening. But yeah, I see your point. However, let's play devil's advocate, though. There's an argument to be made that, yes, this is partially a monetary thing, but what if it also comes from a creative thing as well? What if the director says, look, yes, this will be a little awkward when you go see it in theaters, but the thing is, it's only going to be in theaters for 6 months, and then it's going to live the rest of its life on video. And won't it be great 10 years from now when kids could just sit down and watch a version of the Deathly Hallows that isn't crippled by limitations of time? At that point, it won't be an issue, because then from that point on, they'll just be able to watch the 2 movies as one if they want, and then a lot of these problems will drop away. What would be your response to that?
My response to that is that's not a movie at that point. They should have called it Harry Potter and Deathly Hallows and Harry Potter and the Final Battle. At the end of the day, the only time I'm actually willing to accept this is with Avengers Infinity War, because it's not coming from a specific adaptation of a source material. What I mean is it's not coming from one thing.
It's not a direct adaptation of any single story. Unlike Deathly Hallows, or Mockingjay, Part 1 and Part 2.
When you're splitting up movies, and yes, I'm sure it'd be nice for kids to sit down for 4.5 hours and watch a movie, but at that point, you're not watching a movie, you're watching a TV series.
Or is it that we live in a different age now? Let's say you got the call from somebody to turn My Life as a Video Game into a full-on TV series with a 13-episode first season. You would probably approach remaking it differently, not just because you're remaking it, but because you'd be telling the story in a different way, wouldn't you?
Arguably, that's not the right question to ask me, because for starters, our second season is going to be 12, 22-minute episodes is the plan. And secondly, the way I've built my show is that I've built it more as a television series than as a digital series. There are web series like The Guild or like the first season of Video Game High School, which they're seasons. There were 10-minute episodes, and they all kind of like made it into one movie, and then the next movie came out next year kind of thing as 10-minute segments. Whereas for me, I've done 3-episode arcs, which turn out to be a television episode. I wrote basically 3 television episodes and divided them up.
Okay, I get what you're saying. Let me try and refocus the conversation. Are you automatically then against doing this? Do you think Deathly Hallows Part 1 and Part 2 are lesser films then? Take Deathly Hallows Part 1 and Part 2. Combine it into a single movie. Do you think that single movie might not be better than, hypothetically, a 2-hour version of that film, which is have to cut out so much material?
Absolutely not. Do you know why? Because the adaptation is taking something that exists and adapting it for a new medium. When you are taking something and then just regurgitating it, then you are not adapting it anymore. Like, from a creative standpoint, Harry Potter and Deathly Hallows actually are still pretty good compared to some of the other 2-part movies that are coming or have been. Harry Potter and Deathly Hallows put together as one 4.5-hour-long movie or 4-hour-long movie, however long they are combined. That's a 4-hour movie. That's too long. I'm not going to sit down for 4 hours in the cinema and watch a movie. That is going to kill me.
We're not talking about you sitting down in a cinema and watching this. We're talking about you 5 years from now sitting...
I'm never going to sit down in front of a TV and watch it for that long either. Part of the beauty of a TV series, and the reason Netflix doesn't make a 13-hour-long movie for House of Cards, is because you have a chance to break it up.
Petros, that's actually the opposite of reality. A lot of people do try and watch House of Cards, like, if not a 13-hour movie, then in a 5-6-hour movie or a 4-hour movie. That's what binge watching is all about.
The way we're watching things has changed. If you're going to watch those 2 movies back to back, take like a 10-minute break, go grab some new food, and then start part 2.
But isn't that the way a lot of people do watch movies these days? Like I said earlier, there's the argument to be made. These things get theatrical runs, but those theatrical runs are considered for maybe 3 or 4 months. 6 months if you're lucky. Any kid born today is not going to know what it was like to watch the Harry Potter movies as they came out across the years and one by one, and they're not going to know what it was like. They're not going to have that concern. So in the long run, does it really matter how it was released into theaters? Let's be clear here. A lot of this, like the Mockingjay thing, a lot of this is motivated first and foremost by a studio that wants to make more money, and they can make more money by splitting these out. But that being said, a good director and writer can roll with it, and sometimes can be excited for about it.
So the difference between a 4-hour movie, 2 2-hour movies, and 1 2.5-hour movie is the creative development behind it. 4-hour movie, as a single movie, is too long. It is too long as a single movie because there is no break. There is no stop. And 4-hour movie is too long. I mean, don't get me wrong, I have watched the whole Dark Knight trilogy back to back. I have watched the whole Star Wars trilogy back to back. In fact, I watched Batman Returns, Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises all after each other in one night. All on the big screen. It was exhausting. And kind of made me want to be sick a little bit at times when I was that close to Batman Begins in like the second row on an IMAX screen. Anyway, after the end of every movie, we went out and we had a break. From an artistic and creative standpoint, a 4-hour movie is not something that should exist. Like,
I'm sorry. I can't agree with that right there because, first of all, it's called intermission. It's something plays do all the time. It's something movies used to do. You give people a 20-minute intermission, then they come back in. Certainly, it's things like Lord of the Rings, 3.5 hours. I'm sorry. I mean, I'll let you finish your point, but I don't agree with what you're saying at all. I'm not saying I want every film to be 4 hours. Dear God, no. But I don't think in and of itself there's anything inherently wrong with the concept if you're doing it right. Especially if you throw in an intermission. Those 4 hours could just fly by. Like, a lot of people I know, including my parents,
yes, but do you know what the intermission is? It is the break between 2 separate movies.
Not necessarily.
Yeah,
it's the break between acts.
Because
okay, when you go see a play, if you go see a musical, and it's a 3.5-hour musical, and you get a 20-minute intermission, that doesn't mean Act 1 and Act 2 are separate musicals. That just means they're different. It's just a break. I think you're reading way too much into it, Petros.
No, I'm not. I'm really not, because you're talking about... Look, regardless of how movies are consumed after the fact, movies are built for the cinema. That's how they are made.
Not anymore.
No, but they are. Otherwise, they're a home movie. That's why cinema is having to change the way it does things.
In the same way that what is a TV series is changing in this age of where people go to Netflix and binge watch, what is a movie has changed too. Yes, once upon a time you only watched movies in theaters, but that was a long time ago, Petros.
I'm not saying you only watch a movie in the theater. I'm saying it is built for the theater. That is what a movie is built for.
But maybe that's not as true anymore.
Yeah, but you're talking about the difference between a movie and a series. If it is a series, it is a series. But if we're talking about a movie is something that is to be short and digested, and anything more than 2.5 hours is starting to get a bit long. And there are only few movies that can be allowed that way. Otherwise, it just becomes drivel. It becomes way too much exposition. Looking at Harry Potter and Deathly Hallows, Part 1 alone is way overly long. That movie, which is 2 hours long, could have been 1 hour long.
You want to hear the truth, Petros? I love Deathly Hallows Part 1. Not that I dislike Part 2 either, but I love Part 1. All that stuff that people complain about too slow, I was entranced by it. I was sucked in by it. I loved it. And if it was up to me, I would not have traded the way they did it. I'm glad we got a chance to really see it breathe. I found it really helped put me in the heads of the characters. That I was going on the same journey with them. And by doing it in that method, we also got things like that lovely little animated retelling of the Deathly Hallows that I'm not sure we would have gotten in a shorter 2-hour movie. Because that would have been so desperate to cram everything in. Look, I agree, as with anything, there's a danger in trying to manufacture this stuff. I think that, for instance, Mockingjay definitely suffers to some degree theatrically because of that, but you'll still see that people are really loving Mockingjay Part 1. And I still suspect that 5 years from now, when that is no longer an issue, or 2 years from now, a year from now, when everybody's been able to watch both movies and see the story to its conclusion, they'll feel that somewhat abrupt ending was a fair trade-off. Of course, when it's done badly, it can turn into a slog, but I saw the first 2 Hobbit movies in theaters, and they didn't drag for me. I could have easily sat through another hour right then and there.
I couldn't even get through the first one without snoozing.
I think there's a difference between saying, well, you personally don't like this, and saying it's not viable, and I've certainly...
Is it viable financially? Absolutely. Creatively and artistically, I don't think it is.
So what do you say to the history of plays that goes back where we often have 4-hour plays?
That's a different medium.
It's not so different that you can't apply, in this case, something similar. There's enough similarities there. Honestly, Petros, with no offense, what you're saying is bullshit. At least in my opinion. There's not a magic length. A good movie is as long as it needs to be. Obviously, you could take that to extremes, and certainly there are films that could have used a half hour, an hour trimmed off of them. Like Interstellar, oh my god, you could easily cut an hour out of that movie, because a lot of that is just padding and just pointless. But if the story they're telling supports it, and if it feels right, I don't go into a movie thinking it has to be a certain length. I go to it thinking it needs to be the right length for the story it's telling. And I think that goes by a case-by-case basis. And if somebody can make the argument that, for example, Mockingjay needs to be 2 parts because there's too much material, now, could you do a 2-hour version? Sure. Could it be great? Sure. Would it be better than the version? That's a hypothetical, and it's hard to say. I don't think there's a one right answer in this case, is what I'm saying.
Okay, I'm going to put it this way. As a person who has done work as a script reader before, every time I looked at a script and it was over 130 pages, I would maybe read the first 15 pages, depending on how much I liked the first 5. Generally speaking, you can tell a lot by the first 15 pages of a script. If a script is 150 pages long, I'm almost tempted to just toss it out. If it wasn't my job, if I was doing this for myself as a producer, I would toss it out right there and then. I looked at one of my old scripts, one of the old scripts that I wrote, and it was 127 pages, and I was like, that's way too long. A script generally needs to be 111 pages, 113 pages. That sort of length is kind of perfect, because that makes about a 2-hour movie.
Okay, and I agree that oftentimes brevity tends to be better, and I agree that slavish adaptations are not necessarily good, but I also think that you're talking about is a general rule, with countless exceptions to it that prove it wrong. I think that's a good starting point, certainly, especially for young screenwriters who don't know what the fuck they're doing, who don't have any experience. No. You're going to want to talk too much. You're going to want to write too much. Certainly, it's something I've struggled with in terms of my own writing. I can sometimes just blather on and end up with reviews that are 2, 3, even 4 times too long, and I try to be absolutely brutal with cutting them down, and yet, at the same time, like with my recent Persona Q review, there are instances where I make exceptions and where I go longer because I believe the material I'm covering justifies it. I don't view this as cut and dry as 2 hours is it. 2 hours is it. No,
I'm not saying 2 hours is it. I'm just saying
that is actually what you did say. That is.
I'm saying 2 hours is a very good point that most movies should cut off. 2.5 hours, 3 hours if you have earned it. Now, for example, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, 3 hours, they'd earned that. 2 2-hour movies, I don't think anyone has earned that.
I don't agree. One last example, and to wrap things up, is Stephen King's The Stand, one of his most popular books, been in development hell for years. Now it looks like it's really seriously going forward with Josh Boone, who he was the director of The Fault in Our Stars, among other things. I think he also wrote it. He is going to be adapting The Stand into a film if all goes well for WB. And this one looks like a lot further along than some of these ones. Like it's starting to cast and stuff. Originally, he wrote a single screenplay. If you don't know, The Stand is this massive thing. It's longer than all 3 Lord of the Rings books put together by about 200 pages, okay? It's just this massive, sprawling, that is the word for it. If I had to sum up The Stand in one word, sprawling. He came up with a way by jumping around in time to do it in a single movie, but obviously it would have cut out a lot of stuff. Apparently, the studio loved the script so much, they came to him and said, how would you like to do this as multiple movies? And he said, fuck yes, is his exact word. And so now they're trying to turn The Stand into 4 movies. And I admit, my immediate response was, what? No. Because even as long as The Stand is, 4 movies sounds too much. And it's not just about length, it's I know The Stand. I know how that story flows. And it feels like you're going to have to get some really abrupt... The danger, I think, with splitting 2 movies up is if you hurt the overall storytelling of one film or both films. You know what I mean? And I think that's what you're talking about.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say.
I agree. That could definitely be a concern. That too much time can hamstring you as much as too little. It can force you to keep material that maybe shouldn't be in there, or add material, or, like I said, The Hobbit earlier. I enjoyed the Hobbit films, but I'm not going to lie. I strongly suspect after watching the third one, I'm going to feel, yeah, we really could have cut out the whole dwarf-elf romance. And I suspect I'm going to end the film thinking that too.
Now, don't get me wrong, I still would have wanted at least 2 films. And I'm glad we're getting multiple films, because
I love the fact that we're getting to see the stuff with Gandalf going up against the Necromancer, because that stuff has always struck me as really cool, and I've always wanted to actually see it, because it's only discussed dryly in the appendixes.
I'll admit, there is some pretty cool stuff in The Hobbit, and I would also say this, the problem with them turning them into 3 movies is they're no longer really about The Hobbit anymore.
You want to be honest? Let's be honest. The Hobbit, the book, is a children's novel. He wrote it as a fucking children's novel. He even opens the book talking directly to the audience, saying things like, my darlings, my little ones. He never intended it to be the start of this great epic, and one of the famous pieces of trivia is the first 3 editions of The Hobbit, the encounter with Gollum plays out completely differently. And the ring that Bilbo gets is just a normal, quote-unquote, magic ring. He went back later and changed that to make it fit in with The Lord of the Rings, and he even references that in The Lord of the Rings by Gandalf saying, so you know he published a false book and all that. So, let's not kid ourselves here. The Hobbit was never meant to be this big epic thing, but The Hobbit has to exist now as part of the same universe as The Lord of the Rings. And so, being made as a direct follow-up to these Lord of the Rings movies, okay? We're not talking like it getting made 20 years from now as its own restart of the franchise. It has to be tonally compliant with the Lord of the Rings films, or else people aren't going to go for it.
And yes, changes had to be made, because as much as I love The Hobbit, I also have to admit that the characters are very flat and two-dimensional throughout most of it, because it's just meant to be this silly lark.
But there's no real character development. It's not an accident that the most memorable chapter in that novel is the revised Gollum chapter, because that's the one chapter with some real emotion and heart to it. So, yeah, it's very different from the books, but it's kind of gotta be. That being said, I do suspect 3 movies was too many. We will see. To get back around, I can agree with you, Petros, there's a danger in overextending yourself, and there's a danger trying to stretch this material too far.
And please don't get me wrong, I'm as disturbed as you are going forward at the thought of studios just splitting up films into 2 parts just because they can, just as a money grab. That's a terrible idea. I don't support that. But, well, it may be the norm for a while. That's the world we may live in, and we'll just have to try to make the best of it, and I don't want to automatically disqualify films either just because of that.
Alright, that's going to do it for today's episode. I want to thank Petros for joining me, and basically, I'll just go ahead and tell you all, we went really long, we covered a number of topics, and so I'm going to split that up into a couple of different episodes. So you've just You've just watched the first part of this discussion where we were talking about what we think of the trend of like splitting movies up into two movies and all that. And we certainly got into something of a heated discussion at time.
And before any of you leave comments below, yes, I can appreciate the fact that in an episode about arbitrarily splitting up things into two, I am arbitrarily splitting things up into two. That hasn't escaped me, but there you go.
Next time around, not necessarily next episode, because there's other stuff coming, but next time around, the two of us will talk about what we think of franchising in general and whether or not Hollywood's getting too obsessed with trying to turn everything into the Avengers. And I think we'll be in a bit more agreement on that topic. Maybe not. I guess you'll have to see to find out. Thank you again, as always, Petros, for joining me.
It's okay. Thanks for having me.
And thank all of you for watching. Meanwhile, come back here next week. We'll see the grand return of Thumb Wars with the Dark Lord himself, Lorne Horning. We are going to be talking about his trip to BlizzCon and all the wonderful, amazing things that bastard got to see that I didn't, and I hate him so much. I mean, we'll be talking about stuff. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So, look forward to that. For Channel Awesome and Unrepentant Geeking, I'm Shaun Cronenfeld, wishing you all a pleasant holiday.